So what are archetypes? Archetypes were proposed by Carl Jung in the early 1900s. He claimed that everyone alive today shares what he called the collective unconscious. This collective unconscious is a group of memories and dreams that everyone alive today has access to and is familiar with. Within the collective unconscious, there are extremes that Jung labeled as archetypes. These archetypes usually show up in literature as a particular figure, like a wise old man, a child, a hero, a divine mother. Many of the characters that you're familiar with also, they exhibit traits of multiple archetypes. So, for instance, Gandalf is not only a wise old man archetype, he also follows the god archetype because he has a long list of powers and is essentially immortal. Archetypes show up very often in fairy tales because they can instantly communicate a message to the readers to what the character is supposed to accomplish. Archetypes have no gray area, and they have no other motives, which speaks very well to audiences, particularly children. So now if you use your archetypal knowledge to analyze Little Red Riding Hood, you would find that none of the characters are really true archetypes. They merely hint at archetypes. Little Red Riding Hood is a child, and she is the hero, but only because she has to be. As a child, she's not overly joyful, and she doesn't have any of the archetypal events specific to a child. She's the hero, but again, only because she has to be. She doesn't experience any sort of difficulty, and she doesn't have to overcome any difficulties to reach her conclusion, which is not typical of a hero. The wolf is a trickster, I suppose, because he hides his true identity, but again, that's pretty shallow, and that's really all he does. The huntsman and the grandmother don't have enough at all to even make a conclusion. They don't have any sort of archetypal hints at all, which is why I think the story would be much more interesting if it was told like this. According to Jung, one of the archetypal events most closely tied to a child is separation from their parents. So imagine, if you will, a world where Little Red Riding Hood's parents are dead. They've just died. We don't know how. Little Red Riding Hood now requires support from someone else because she's not able to support herself. So she's going to go to her grandmother's house in the middle of the forest. On her way there, she meets the wolf. And the wolf trots over to her basically just to see how he can mess up her day. He doesn't care about eating her. He doesn't want to know what's actually going on. He just wants to cause as much chaos as he can. But Little Red Riding Hood, being naive and oddly happy still, even though her parents are dead, tells the wolf everything he needs to know. So the wolf sends Little Red Riding Hood a long way around the forest and runs to the grandmother's house before she gets there. He then eats the grandmother, disposes of the body, and gets in the grandmother's clothes, as per the traditional story. Little Red Riding Hood shows up at the house, sees the wolf in the grandmother's clothes, is confused, but still thinks it's her grandmother somehow. She asks the grandmother/wolf a bunch of questions, eventually finds out that it is the wolf, not her grandmother, and then calls for the huntsman. Now, before the huntsman can get there, the wolf, who is smart enough not only to talk, but to trick a little girl and disguise himself, escapes out the window. And the huntsman arrives to see Little Red Riding Hood crying in an empty room full of blood. Now, the huntsman, not being a horrible human being, takes Little Red Riding Hood under his wing. He gives her a home, he gives her food, he also teaches her the ins and outs of hunting. He trains her in tracking, he trains her in shooting, he steadily teaches her all of the ins and outs of the forest from his huge knowledge of hunting. Several years later, Little Red Riding Hood is hunting, and she sees the wolf's den. She then uses her hunting knowledge that she's accumulated to sneak up to the wolf's den and murder the wolf. She then is now freed from her childhood trauma and goes on to live happily ever after. This is a much better story if you're looking through an archetypal lens, because all of the characters are closer to true archetypes now. Little Red Riding Hood is very clearly a child in the beginning. She's naive and happy, and she's separated from her parents, which is required by Jung for some reason. And she's very naive. She doesn't know anything that's going on, and she is stuck. The wolf is a trickster still, but he's much more bent on chaos. He's not merely in it for some other gain. He's purely to cause chaos, which is much closer to the trickster that he's supposed to be. The huntsman, in this case, actually becomes a father figure. He's the father archetype in this story. He supports Little Red Riding Hood, and he trains her, and he gives her food and clothes. He also is a little bit of a wise old man in this one, because he has this huge knowledge of the forest that the reader is not really privy to. The grandmother I just brought out of the story, she didn't serve a purpose in the first one, really. She doesn't serve a purpose in this one. I think it's better.